Welcome back to our second session and our conversation about the Black Pharaohs. I recall in our first session, we stressed the fact that there is this commonality in terms of origin between the people of Kemet or Misra or Egypt and the people of Kush. Because, of course, they are the descendants of two brothers, Kush, the son of Ham, and Misra, the son of Ham. And we talked about the fact that biblically, those people were treated and thought of as Black. We looked at the Table of Nations, chapter 10, which looks at the lineage and lays out the lineage of the descendants of Noah. And we also looked at Psalms 105, which interchangeably calls Egypt Ham. We talked about the fact that there were some pharaohs, the first pharaoh, Narmer, and others like Amenhotep III, who clearly were Black. And although that has been disputed by some of the Eurocentric scholars, it's not really in debate among those who is just simply trying to get to what the evidence is one way or another. So if this is a study about the Black pharaohs, you may wonder why we're spending time, or we're going to spend time talking about Kush. And I'm telling you, because number one, some of the initial pharaohs were in fact Black people or Kushites. And number two, there was a point, and we discussed this, during 656 BC, where clearly there was I won't say an invasion, but an entrance of the Kushite people, the Kushite royalty coming from the city of Napata, which we'll talk about in just a moment, into Egypt during the Egyptians' third intermediary period. And we talked about what that was. There were three intermediary periods, and that was a nice way of saying that the Egyptian central government collapsed. And so there was just essentially chaos, and you had lords or chiefs or whatever they call themselves who reigned over certain regions, but there was no unified front. So let's go further into our conversation now, shall we? Looking at Kush, and then we are working our way, keeping in mind that we're working our way toward the emergence of the 25th dynasty, which everyone agrees was clearly of Kushite origin. The Empire of Kush has its origins in what was called the A group. A group occupied the region toward the southern part of Egypt on the Nile River. That civilization began to form somewhere around 3800 BC. And it lasted from 3800 BC to 3100 BC. George Breasted, the Harvard Egyptologist that we spoke about in our first lecture, was the one who gave this group of people that name, because he really didn't have a name, but he saw that there was evidence, clear evidence of a civilization. Didn't have a name for it, so he called it the A group. And that, excuse me, that was one of the groups that formed the cultural and religious basis for what later became the Kushite Empire. A second group of people that George Reisner identifies as what he called the C group. The C group, again, had a particular culture that ultimately led to the formation of the Kush Empire. It existed between 2300 BC and 1500 BC. So there's some overlap there. The first Kushite empire of note in secular sources is Kerma. Sometimes Kerma is referred to and thought of as a Nubian empire unto itself. But generally, when Kushite archaeologists who specialize in the empire of Kush, I don't know what they call themselves. I know that archaeologists who specialize in the study of Egypt refer to themselves as Egyptologists. So there's a similar, more recent discipline that has been formed where there's a study of Kush, that significant Black civilization, and it's worthy, it's deserving of that study because, as I said in the first lecture, it existed for 2,700 years. And by way of comparison, you can't identify a European empire that existed for 1/3 of that time, 1/4 of that time. So we can't gloss over the fact that, but the actual founding of the Kushite Empire begins with the formation of this organized and to some degree militarized, centralized city state that is referred to as Kerma. Kerma existed from 2500 BC to 1500 BC. That's 1,000 years, folks. That's nothing to sneeze at. They were doing something right. They traded with Egypt. They intermarried with Egypt, and periodically they fought with Egypt. And ultimately, that was the thing that led to Kerma's sacking, the fact that they fought with Egypt at times. Geographically speaking, and I touched on this before, I believe I did, and if I haven't, I'm going to touch on it now. When the Egyptians referred to their country, they referred to it as Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. But their upper is counterintuitive to what we think. When we say upper, we're thinking the northern part of a state or of a region. But when the Egyptians referred to Upper Egypt, they were actually talking about Southern Egypt. And similarly, when the Kushites referred to Upper Kush, they were referring to the southern part of the country. Why is that? Because both civilizations oriented themselves in terms of the flow of the Nile River. If you're not familiar with this fact, it's significant. The Nile River is one of the only rivers in the world that flows from south to north. And the reason for that is that the southern part of where the Nile River is geographically is hilly and in some instances mountainous. So we know that water flows downhill. And in the delta region of Egypt, near the mouth of the river where it pours out into the Mediterranean Sea, that's flat land. So that's how the Egyptians and the Kushite people oriented themselves, upper and lower. So the border between Egypt and Kush was just a little bit south of the third cataract in the Nile River. What is a cataract? A cataract is a stone formation within the river that when the river water level is low, makes it impossible for boats to pass. So in the Nile River, there are 6 distinct cataracts. The third cataract served roughly as a border, a national border between the Egyptian Empire and the Kushite Empire. And there was crossings. There were times when the Egyptians would come down and battle and take certain parts of the Kushites' lands. But then the thing that has been downplayed is that there were times when the Kushites would go in with incursions and take parts of the Egyptians' land. So it was a back and forth. All right. But something significant happened in around the year 1500. During the New Kingdom, there was a Semitic group from the Levant. And when I say the Levant, I'm talking about today where Israel is, where Syria is, where Jordan is, where Lebanon is. That's the Levant. That's the land bridge between Africa and Asia. Okay. So there was a Semitic pastoral group of individuals that invaded Egypt. They were referred to as the Hyksos. The Hyksos formed an alliance with the Kushites, and they worked together to take Egyptian land, to battle them. And that certainly raised the ire of the Egyptians even more as it relates to their relationship, which was good and bad, was kind of like an abusive relationship. Love you, hate you, love you. Well, that made the Egyptians hate them more. So then what happened in 1500 with the ascendancy of Pharaoh, whose name was, I'm going to get this right, his name was Tutmos the First. Tutmos the First. Tutmos the First said, essentially, we're going to put this back and forth thing, we're going to bring it to a complete end. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to bring to bear all of our military might and influence. We're not going to just send contingencies, but we're going to come in full bore, and we're going to blow up. We're going to totally destroy Kerma. Kerma was the capital at that time of the Kushite Empire, right? So that's what they did. The Egyptians entered into the city of Kerma, which again was a beautiful city, was a well laid out city. They had temples, they had palaces, they had mud brick temples that were called defufas. They had royal palaces that arguably rivaled the Egyptian palaces. And they had products such as, they were known for the pottery that they developed that had a particular black ring that was like their signature pottery. They were experts at producing beautiful, gorgeous pieces of pottery. And the Egyptians said, you know what? We're tired of fighting with you, going back and forth. So we're not going to just build a wall, because they did actually from time to time build forts at the borders and along the way to guard against the intrusion of the Kushites and other foreign entities. But what they did in 1500, what Tutmos the First did, is he invaded, he razed that city, he burned it to the ground, he destroyed the temples, he destroyed the palaces, he enslaved some of the Kushite people and took them back to Egypt, and he set up what was called a viceroy, which was basically a governor, and Kush became a colony of Egypt, or Kemet, or Mizra, for roughly 500 years. 500 years. Now, it's significant. That's a number that's significant, because it seems like in a 500-year period, those people would be scattered to the wind. They would lose their identity. They would lose their will to resist. They would be fully assimilated and essentially just Egyptians by other names and different colors, right? I mean, that's what you would think. But they did not. There was intermarrying. The Kushite people, and remember the word Kush by definition, if you look it up in the Bible, if you have what is called a strong concordance, what's going to jump out at you, there's just one word that exists in the definition of there's a main word, and that's black. So undeniably, these are black people. For 500 years, they were under the thumb. And I want you to compare and contrast that to the fact that in 1990, or rather 1898, I'll get my years right, the Europeans met, I believe, in Berlin to carve up the continent of Africa. That was in 1898, and they had colonies. France had colonies in Africa. England had colonies. For example, England's colony was South Africa was one of the colonies. Kenya was one of the colonies. Nigeria was one of the colonies of England. The French had Senegal, and the Portuguese rather had, I believe, what is today Angola. So they, as far as they were concerned, they were going to control these people forever. They were going to just reap the benefits. One of the reasons why the Europeans and other foreign people came into Africa back then is because Kush, let's talk about Kush, and then we'll get to the broader conversation, because the only reason why we're embarking upon this conversation, folks, is because the strategies, the strength, the perspective that the African people had back then is useful, beneficial, and instructive to us today. The Egyptians traded with the Kushite people before they colonized them. But what they really wanted from the Kushite people more than anything else, even though they traded in different products, what they wanted more than anything else was their gold. The gold that you see that inlaid the caskets and the tombs of the pharaohs, all the gold that you see in all the images, most of that came from Kush. Kush had an endless amount of gold, and everyone wanted that gold. And in modern day times, we go fast forward to 1898 when the Europeans colonized much of Africa, most of Africa. I say most of Africa because they were never successful in colonizing Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, rightfully so, takes great pride in the fact that they were never colonized by the Europeans. But getting back to Kush in 1500 BC, for 500 years, they were not broken. Their wills to be autonomous, their sense of being distinct and being powerful and being useful in the world and having something to contribute and having something to say on the world stage and being equal, if not greater than their temporary oppressors, it never waned. I say that because Black people were enslaved in this country for 400 years. And I don't know that the goal at the beginning was to assimilate Black people. And just as I don't think that the goal of the Egyptians were at that point that they came in 1500 BC to assimilate them, was to punish them, to dominate them, and to exploit their natural resources. That's what it was about. It's always about that when it comes to colonization and slavery. So I hope you can see some parallels, because what happens next, to me, gives us, and I'm speaking about Black people in the Western Hemisphere, particularly Black people living in America. But what happens next in this saga is very interesting, and I think unprecedented in history. So there's this period of 500 years where the new kingdom is existing, and Kush has been incorporated and made a colony under the foot of a viceroy, an Egyptian person that's appointed in the same way that the Romans appointed Pontius Pilate or Herod to be a local ruler, a vassal of the Roman Empire. So it was with the viceroy who was sent to Kush to rule over Kush. What did the Kushite people do during that time? They did learn the religion and embrace the religion of the Egyptians. Now, the Egyptians, as well as the Kushites, had many different gods, but the superior god, the invisible God, was Amun, spelled Amun, Ra, Ra. Actually, if you look at the evolution of the Egyptian gods, you'll see at some point in their history, Amun and Ra were two different gods. Amun was the invisible god, and Ra was the god that was depicted by the sun, the image of the sun. But at some point in their religious history, the two merged and became one god, Amun-Ra. But the reason why I am discussing that is because during this 500-year period, the Kushite people embraced Amun-Ra and became very committed to the notion that the system of Ma'at, which is spelled M-A-A-T, which is divine order, divine balance, justice, was to be preserved, should be the foundation and the glue that holds civilization together. They vehemently embraced that and then began to practice it with greater zeal and greater determination and greater fidelity than the Egyptians who imparted that, who shared that with them during their time of enslavement and colonization. There is a modern day um, what's the word I want to use? There's a modern day example of that, uh, um, um, because that's what happened with Black people in slavery. We had different gods that we worshiped when we were enslaved, but at some point, it cannot be argued that the majority of the African slaves, and still today in the United States of America, the majority of Black people embrace and identify themselves as Christians. It can be argued, but I think that the objective evidence shows that Black people today are more committed, numerically speaking, statistically speaking, to the Christian faith, to practicing it, to going to church on a regular basis, to praying on a regular basis, to reading the Bible on a regular basis than the European former slave masters who introduced this Christianity to them, the form. And this is not the lecture, but I would tell you that what was introduced to the African slaves was a very aberrant form of Christianity. But nevertheless, the slaves and the descendants of slaves, myself included, embraced it. But what's unique and what's instructive and what's interesting and what's exciting is that how Black people responded to religion back in 1500 BCE, and how they went all in, so to speak, and how they actually became more zealous and more faithful in the execution and the practice and the observance of the religion is consistent with how Black people are performing in the Western Hemisphere. Today, we are still far more religious than all other people. So all of that is to say that we are connected to Africa, that we are behaving like Africans, even though we have been in the West for 400 years. But that's what the Kushite people did. Even though they had been oppressed for 500 years, they still had a certain way that they approached the life itself. So let's go further. What happened at the end of the 500 years? Well, Egypt's central government fell apart once again in 1069 BC. What did the Kushite people do when their overlords and their slave masters were weakened? Well, initially what they did was just take a breather, so to speak, because from 1069 BC to 900 BC, there really wasn't one unified Kushite polity or government as such. There were, again, regional, it wasn't an official intermediate period. It was, I would say, a recovery period, right? That's how I interpret what was going on. People were just taking a breath and being glad to be free from their Egyptian overlords who retreated back north of that third cataract that I talked about before. In other words, they went back home. They threw in the towel. They couldn't govern themselves, let alone govern people in foreign lands. But what happened in 900 BC is beautiful and it's Black. And I hope that in sharing this with you, you are inspired, because the greatness that was in them is in us today. The ability to reinvent oneself, to rise up against considerable odds that you won't ever be able to rise. Most empires that existed, who once they were out of existence, so to speak, once they were under the control of, under the thumb of an invading force for 500 years, they were gone, they were done, they were finished. But what happened with the people of Kush in 900 BC is that they moved their capital, which at one point was Kerma, right? That existed for 1,000 years. They moved it further south down the river, and they identified or located or situated a new capital that was referred to as Napata. Now, Napata is significant for a couple of reasons. The Kushite people say two things. We need to get further south, away from Egypt. We need to put distance between our capital and their capital, which I believe at that time was Thebes. Could have been Memphis, but you can look at that. But I believe it was Thebes. And so they moved and it just made sense, right? Put distance between yourself and the enemy, or the opponent, your enemy. I don't want to live in the same neighborhood as someone that I've been fighting, someone that imprisoned me, someone that enslaved me. No, I want to get some distance. So they moved their capital to the second location, which is Napata, Napata, Napata. So Napata is significant not only because it creates distance between the two capitals and the two people, but secondly, it is located near a sacred site that both the Egyptians and the Kushite people recognize as sacred, and that is the mountain, the stone mountain it's a stone mountain of. Let me make sure I'm saying that right. It's sandstone mountain. That's the word that's missing in my explanation. It's a sandstone mountain in the middle of the desert, not too far from the Nile River, because of course the river drives everything, right? But because both now embrace the same God, who they consider to be the high God, the invisible God, the creator God, Amun-Ra, they also believe that he, the God Amun-Ra, resides in that mountain, that is his residence. So I think it's strategic that not only are they building their capital at a great distance from Egypt's capital, but they are also building their capital near perhaps the holiest site in the religion that both of them share and both of them revere. And so that's significant because in their actions, they're saying, not only are we building a new city, we survive, we don't die, we multiply, all of that stuff. You didn't kill us, we're still standing. But they're saying we're standing now near this God that you introduced us to, that you don't serve, that you don't actually believe in. By your actions, you demonstrate that you are not a true follower of Ma'at. Again, what is Ma'at? The system of order, the system of justice, the system. I believe that there are 47 negative confessions. And these negative confessions, it may be 40, but again, don't quote me on that part of it, but I believe it is 47 negative confessions. As opposed to thou shalt not steal, the Egyptians believe that when they die, that their heart would be put in a scale. On one side, their heart, on the other side, a feather. And so if they had no wrongs that they committed in their life, then their heart would be light as a feather. And you go through these negative confessions. I did not steal my neighbor's possessions. I did not covet my neighbor's wife. I did not commit murder, etc. And it sounds similar, right, to thou shalt not. But instead of a proactive statement, these are negative confessions which predated the Ten Commandments. So again, they locate their capital, Kerma, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal. That's the name of the mountain, Jebel Barkal, where the Egyptians and the Kushite people believed the god Amun-Ra resided. That capital exists for roughly, let's say, for a period of roughly 300 years. We think about the United States of America. It hasn't been in existence for 250 years, and it's already starting to wild out. We've already had one civil war, and people say civil war will happen, it could happen, we could have a race war. I don't ever see us having a race war in this country because Black people are 14% of the US population. But what can happen is a partisan war, right? where people are so extreme in their ideological positions that they can't reconcile, and they're so caught up in their little ideological silos that they actually hate their fellow Americans. I may be digressing off point here, but I'm pointing out that Kush had two capitals at this point. Kush found the way to reinvent itself. It speaks to something that I think should be inspiring to Black people today, and that is there was that resilience, there was that determination, and it was fueled, it was facilitated by faith in something, in someone that was greater than us. Human beings always go off course, right? They always go off task when they begin to think that they are an end unto themselves. So we're going to talk more about the 25th dynasty, but what I will tell you is that from this base, Napata, the Kushites begin to, I won't say plot, but plan a invasion of Egypt. In other words, the people that had been dominated for 500 years begin to plot or to construct a design that would cause them to become the rulers of their former oppressors. It's quite unique, I think, in human history. I don't know that it's ever happened before. Certainly after 500 years of being under the foot of people, one people rising up. But this is the story of the Black pharaohs. It's interesting. It's not just historical. What I'm stressing is that those people were our people. They were Black people. And we have to take pride in that. And we have to teach our sons and daughters about Kush because it speaks to them at a level that goes beyond the cognitive processes. And it tells them about the greatness and the goodness that God has deposited in them. Because for hundreds of years, initially explicitly, but even today implicitly, so many images, so many messages have been given to our children, our sons and our daughters, that say we don't really have much. The only thing that we have by way of civilization is what was given to us, what was taught to us. By way of religion is what the Europeans gave us. And so our best hope and greatest hope is to become Black Europeans in Black skin. And that's a non-starter. And that's not just, it's not true factually. So sometimes we can learn and we can be inspired and we can be bolstered mentally, spiritually, psychologically, and otherwise by looking back at where the Lord, if I'm putting on the reverend hat, where the Lord has brought us from. And then we can have some idea, really, because I study history, because it gives me hope in terms of what will happen in the future. Last thing I want to say in this lecture is that, consistent with this theme that the Kushite people kept reinventing themselves. At some point, the Kushite rulers, the Kushite royalty, did in fact enter into Egypt to become the rulers and the masters of Egypt. But it wasn't through a process of military might initially. The visionary, the first known prince of Kush, and then the first known king of Kush is a man by the name of Alara. Alara had a vision. He understood geopolitical matters. He was sophisticated. He was educated. He was deeply religious. And he had a vision that not by the sword, but by the encouragement of convincing the Egyptians that they were adrift spiritually. Yes, spiritually, not politically, not economically, but the reason why the Egyptians were in one of those intermediate periods, the reason why their central government fell apart was because there was corruption from the pharaoh to the priest. And whenever you have corruption in government and in religion, it's only a matter of time before civilization falls apart. So Lara says, no, I'm not going to use this opportunity to go in and to try to exploit the Egyptians, even though maybe they deserve it since they colonized us and enslaved us for 500 years. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to speak, to preach redemption to them. We're going to formulate a long range plan because you see, Alara, even though he was the visionary and he was the former or the forerunner or the first known king of what became the 25th dynasty, he never himself personally entered Egypt. He just set the foundation, the psychological, the spiritual, and the cultural framework for his sons and his grandsons to go in and to actually ultimately rule over Egypt, which they did, which we're going to talk about in great length later. But they did go in and they ruled over their former overlords. I think that's a beautiful story because I think obviously they had some help from God to be able to conquer at that time, the most powerful and the most militarily advanced nation on planet Earth. Even though the Kushites were known as the pupil, as in your eyeball smiters, because the one thing that the Kushites were known for, even though they were deeply religious people, they were also very adept and very adroit military warriors. Another name that the Egyptians used to refer to Kush by was Ta-Seti. The Egyptian word Ta means land, and Seti means bow. The Egyptians referred to Kush as the land of the bow, and that was because those warriors were all sharpshooters. In fact, in other times when they were on good terms, when Egypt was at war with other people from the Near East, they would employ warriors from Kush as mercenaries, as marksmen, as experts. And at other times, when they were at peace with Kush, they would employ the Magi to be like the secret service for the pharaoh. So the Kushites had a great mastery of the military arts, but they didn't use any of that to conquer Egypt and to establish the 25th dynasty. They used their brain, they used culture, and they used religion, and that was the vision of Alara. And we'll talk more about that. But at some point, the reign of the Kushites over Egypt came to an end, and that was because an empire from the east, Assyria, came in and drove them out of Egypt. And when the Assyrians drove the Kushites, the Kushite pharaohs, the black pharaohs, out of Egypt, that was not the end of Kush. Kush reinvented itself. It moved its capital further south. Now it established its third capital, its third and final capital, Meroë. It established and it thrived there for another roughly 1,000 years. So it's a beautiful story. These black people are going to battle with great military powers, trading, interacting, doing whatever they need to do to survive, adapting, adjusting. And at the center of the narrative of Kush is religion, faith in God, the invisible, the all-powerful God, who they refer to as Amun-Ra. I would tell you that if you look at the characteristics of their God, not get lost on names, some of the characteristics that they use to describe their God that they said really can't be seen may sound somewhat like the God of the Bible. I'm not saying that he was, but and we're not even going into that lecture. That's another lecture on another day. But they had some connection, obviously, to God, because that's the only way they could have accomplished the things that they accomplished. This is the end of lecture 2. I hope that I've whet your appetite enough to stick around for lecture 3. And that'll be coming out shortly. Stay tuned.